Greetings from Michigan. It is a beautiful fall day. Welcome to Mobile Learning, What You Need to Know. My name is Sarah Zagilla, and I'm the Business Development Executive at Innovative Learning Group. Mobile has been a top learning trend in the industry over the last couple of years in both design and technology. So it thrills me to be able to introduce our two experts today who will be giving answers to questions we commonly hear from our clients. For those of you who are new to ILG, I'd like to give a brief overview of who we are and what we do. ILG designs and develops custom learning and performance support solutions. We've been in business for 13 years, but many of our team have been creating learning solutions a lot longer. We really care about, and what differentiates us is our focus on performance and helping organizations reach their business goals. For us, it's always about performance first. We work with a diverse group of medium and large-sized companies all across the country, some of which we have served on a global basis. We are truly proud of all of our partnerships. Overall, we have more than 140 clients across 35 industries, with more than half of our work being outside of Michigan. Now for a little background on our presenters, Susan Fisher and Matt Kurtin. Susan is ILG's lead instructional designer and learning consultant. She has more than 30 years of experience designing and developing training and performance support resources. Susan is widely versed in information architecture, portal design, and using mobile delivery for learning. She's also a certified professional technical communicator as designated by the Society for Technical Communication. Next, we have Matt Kurtin. Matt is ILG's lead programmer and learning technology consultant, and also leads the company's mobile learning strategy. He's no stranger to e-learning and has 20 years of experience developing courses, having authored more than 500 of them. Matt also consults with our clients on their learning portal and learning management system needs. So with that, let's get started. Susan?
Well, thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you came today. As Sarah said, our clients often ask us questions about developing mobile learning, and most of them hit on a handful of common themes. And so in today's webinar, we hope to address those frequently asked questions by providing some best practices. So here's the first set of questions. When I design courses for mobile delivery versus desktop, do I need to think differently? Do I need to learn new skills? So the actual question here is, isn't designing mobile learning pretty much the same as designing e-learning? So the short answer is no, but mostly what you may need to learn is a new way of thinking about your learning product. So some key points about mobile. It's not just another distribution channel, it's a whole different ballgame. People use mobile devices differently and in different environments than they do PCs. Screen sizes are different, functionality is different, and purpose may be different too. But before we go into any more detail, one thing stays the same, and I have to stress this for all of you instructional designers out there. You still need to adhere to good instructional design principles. So we, a few years back, wanted to start thinking about, what makes something good for mobile delivery. And so here you see some different types of learning, so both formal and informal learning. And the technology exists to deliver any of these types of learning on mobile devices. But the question we asked ourselves is, just because they can be delivered mobily, should they be delivered mobily for any learning need? So we had to look at what differentiates mobile delivery. So we came up with a few sort of parameters that we wanted to look at for assessing a learning need as being good for mobile delivery. So they come in these three categories: learning need, so tending towards skill level and requiring learning reinforcement over time, may apply to a particular work context. Learning content, it's used as performance support. That's a big indicator for mobile learning. It can be provided in small chunks, another good indicator for mobile learning. May include computational tasks or communication or any kind of functionality that's available on a mobile device. And finally, about the learners. The learners are often or always mobile. That's good for mobile learning. So before I move on, I just want to point out this photograph, which is kind of old, getting kind of old, but it's from 2012, I believe. It was after, or maybe 11, it was after the Virginia earthquake of August 2011, when there were cracks that started to appear in the Washington Monument after the earthquake. And so this is a great example of using mobile delivery for learning or performance support. This is a structural engineer who's hanging off the side of the Washington Monument. And I don't know if you can see, she's got a tablet in her hand, and she's using it to both look at schematics for the monument and to also mark places where she's seen cracks in the structure. So that's like great. That's like a perfect example for mobile. So assuming that you have a good learning need and learning content and learners who are appropriate for mobile, the next thing you have to do is look at design. And so we came up with these 6 factors in mobile design, and I'm just going to go through them very briefly. Number 1, what experience should the solution provide? You have to understand your learners, whatever performance issues they need to solve, and how and when and where they're going to use that learning solution. Number 2, what's the scope? So limit content only to what actually serves the learner's performance needs. Structure your content in short, discrete chunks that can stand on their own. 3, be deliberate in how you organize the structure of your content. Create an information architecture that serves the learner and the need. 4, what form should the content take? So here you carefully have to consider the media and interactivity to include in the solution. You want to make sure that they're appropriate to the device, the learner's environment, and the need. 5, what device-specific functions are needed? So think about the functions that are built into any mobile device, your phone today. You can capture audio-visual data, you can communicate out, you can use your phone or texting. You've got location awareness, you've got augmented reality, motion sensing. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's available in your device, and it keeps increasing all the time. And finally, what's the user interface like? So that's the screen layout, the graphic look, the navigation, the action controls. All of these are different on a mobile device versus a laptop or a desktop. So we're going to talk more about this in a bit. I could do a whole nother session just on all of these 6 factors, but we're not going to delve into all of them. We're going to spend more time on 6, at least as far as I'm concerned. And Matt's going to do some different content as well. But before I move on to Matt, are there any questions at this point? Okay, here's one. What's an example of something that shouldn't be on mobile? Good question, because there are definitely things that should not be delivered on mobile, and I can think of one really great example right off the bat. A 2-hour e-learning on the company's intellectual property policies. That's definitely not something that you want to put on mobile for all of the reasons that we've already talked about briefly in our 6 factors. Okay, Matt, take it away.
All right, Sue, thank you. And great there that you're focusing on when are the right cases to use it. But as I focus sometimes more on the development side where you're on the design side, sometimes I'm asked the question, I have a whole bunch of traditional e-learning courses and I want to convert them to mobile. Is there an easy way I can quickly convert them so that they could be used on a mobile device. So let's set aside for a moment a little bit that might not always be a good idea and talk about how you could convert and what some of the trade-offs are there. So one of the first things that's going to come into play is whether when you say I want to convert to mobile, you really mean I want to convert to tablet, or I want to convert to phone, or I want to convert to both. Because if you're converting from a computer to a tablet, you can pretty much assume you have the same screen space available and you don't have to deal with that issue. But if you're going to convert also for phone, then you've got a much smaller screen size, and then you have some other things to worry about. Then there are some things that you could do with a mouse and a computer that you just can't do on mobile. So for instance, things that would be triggered by rolling over something with the mouse on the computer would need to be changed to a different action, a tap or another kind of gesture on a tablet or a phone. Another problem you could run into is the size of the buttons. The mouse cursor you can position very precisely, but some things that get converted to mobile, if the button is smaller than about 40 pixels by 40 pixels, for all intents and purposes, on a tablet it's almost impossible to press it if it's too small. And then, as Sue was pointing out, the length of the content, you just really don't want to take a really long course when you only can see a tiny bit of the content at a time. Now, I also wanted to point out a couple of things about the technology here, because the tools that have been designed for developing e-learning courses, which delivered everything in Flash, have gotten updates over time. So now you can go to your Articulate or your Captivate or your Lectora, and you can publish for HTML instead of Flash, and that's going to help you get things to some of those devices. So depending on what authoring tool you used, if you used Flash before, you don't have the same kind of luck, but if you use an older version of one of these other authoring tools, potentially you could just open it up in the newer version, and then you could publish for HTML, and you could reach mobile devices, excepting dealing with the things that we've already talked about on the screen so far here. Another thing that I want to point out is this Puffin web browser. And this is something that there's another one called Photon that's similar, but essentially they're things that let you use Flash Player on a mobile device when you can't use it on the regular browsers like Safari and the Android browsers and so on. And it can actually be quite helpful, because let's say that you were going to convert a bunch of e-learning that was delivered in Flash and you wanted to be able to run it on an iPad, for instance. You could provide these Puffin web browser apps for people, and they would be able to run that Flash content on their tablet without having to do any conversion whatsoever. That could be tremendously cost effective versus the time it might take to rebuild all that training if you don't have a tool that lets you just click and go. So with that, I'll stop and see if there are questions here. So it looks like there's a question. Are you saying create and Captivate for Apple products and not Flash? So the advantage, like one of the strongest advantages to tools like Captivate or Storyline, Articulate Storyline, is that once you develop in that type of a tool, you can click and say, I want to publish it in either Flash or HTML5 or both. And the fact that you can do both is pretty important too, because I think sometimes people kind of have the misconception that if I could just publish for HTML5 now, I'm good. Well, that's true if you only need to go to mobile, but if you need something that's going to run on mobile, but also on your computer browsers as well, if you have a Internet Explorer, or even some of the most recent versions of Internet Explorer, they really can't run all the things that you need in HTML5. So having an HTML5 version works good on the mobile, but not the computer. So the power of these tools that can publish to both HTML5 and Flash is a very handy thing to have. All right, Sue, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Matt. So here's our next FAQ. What screen design considerations do I need to keep in mind when developing for mobile delivery? So remember factor 6 from that list that I showed you before. What is the user interface like. So that's where our key design decisions have to be made. A good user interface means a good user experience. And what's involved in that interface is the layout of the screen, the graphic and the graphic look, the navigation, and any action controls. So if you're familiar with designing interfaces for e-learning or desktop websites, beware that designing for mobile devices and mobile learning is a different animal. So what I want to show now is a few examples of good user experience or user interface design from the commercial or consumer app world. And the reason I like to look at apps that all of us can get from the App Store and so on is that they've been doing this now for several years, and the people that are designing those apps are really good at it, and they can give us all some good ideas and teach us some things. So my first examples here are screen layout and graphic look, and I've got 3 phone examples here from different eras, 2012, 2014, and 2016. And, take a look at the placement of the components on the screen, meaning content, functions, and navigation. These will all take into consideration the device characteristics, screen size, screen orientation options, whether there's a physical or virtual keyboard and that kind of thing. And then also take into consideration where, when, and how it's used, down to how people actually hold the device in their hand and how they reach and tap the screen. You can see here, the difference in the graphic look from very skeuomorphic on the left side with the level, making it look like wood grain and like it's a real level, all the way to the other side, the Fitbit app, which is very flat look, which is currently the design preference of the day. It's sort of going back from really super flat to less flat. There's a little bit more dimension to things these days, but you can see that the Fitbit app is very, very simple, lots of white space. And as you look at these, start noticing how the content is treated versus the navigation elements. And here's another one from an iPad. So it's a tablet. You can see there's a little bit difference between this and the phone. There's obviously more space available. Now let's look at navigation with some more phone examples and take a look at, again, as I said, take a look at the difference between content and navigation. So what you will see, I think, is that content is taking up a lot more space than navigation. So menus are very, very limited. Like in the Yelp example on the left, there's a menu along the bottom, there's a menu, sub-menu in the top middle of the screen. Twitter for iPhone, menu along the bottom. The Whole Foods app on the right side is a slide-out menu by clicking the hamburger icon that you can see just on the right side. When you click that, you get a slide-out menu. So here are different ways of treating the navigation, but the key thing about the navigation is it's as minimal as possible, because with the limited space of mobile, you need to reserve as much space for the actual content as possible. So you want to remember, keep your menus to very, very simple, no more than 3 levels at the very most. 2 or even 1 level of menu is the best. And you can see that all of these examples are single level menus. Next, action controls and touch targets. You need to use touch gestures consistently. You don't want to use complicated or unfamiliar or custom ones. Mostly these sort of gestures are usually built into the operating system, so it's not that big of a deal. In earlier days, people were coming up with their own touch gestures, and that wasn't such a great idea. But another thing you want to remember is the touch targets. So ideal placement for primary navigation is what people can easily touch, if they're using their thumb. And you want to put anything that's dangerous outside of this range. Like if there's a delete key, don't put your delete key in the middle of this primary navigation zone. You want people to have to work for it. So what is the user interface like? Here are some tips. Make the content primary and navigation intuitive and minimal. Reduce and keep on reducing some more the interface content. Understand the device's built-in navigation and use it consistently. And design to the screen size. If you're using multiple sizes, or your devices will have multiple sizes, the standard conventional wisdom is to design for the smallest screen size first and then expand. So then we get into the discussion of responsive or adaptive design, about layout elements adjusting to their relative positions at different screen sizes. Matt will be talking more about this next. Device-specific design. Different layouts can be designed to accommodate each device's common user posture, primary input method, average display size, and hard and soft controls. So those are all things, of course, with the many different types of devices that are out there that you need to at least give some thought to. Okay, before we move on to the next set of frequently asked questions, any questions from the audience? Okay, no questions that I can see at this point. I think we should probably move on, Matt.
All right, I do see some questions that are coming in about responsive design and the tool to pick. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what responsive design and adaptive design means so that we get everybody on the same playing field. So one thing I'll point out is sometimes when people talk about adaptive design, they might be talking about more like personalization or branching to certain content based on what's the right content for your role or your preferences or that sort of thing. But that's not the adaptive that I'm talking about right now. Both responsive and adaptive design here are specifically about how to handle when the screen size gets smaller. So with adaptive design, what happens is you pick a few different layouts for different sizes and then you show that layout. This type of approach is adequate when all sizes are known in advance. And adaptive, it could have one smaller size or it could have a few smaller sizes. But how that differs from responsive design, in responsive design, instead of just picking this layout or that layout, the whole layout changes to a new layout depending on the size. Each of the elements that are in your design can be treated differently as the size goes smaller. So for instance, as you think of starting at the larger size and gradually shrinking down to a smaller and smaller size by selecting all the different devices with different screen sizes in between, you can do things like have images shrink and the font size stay the same. Or you could have things like the font size gets gradually smaller to a certain point, and then the images shrink to a certain point, and at some point when the screen gets too small, the images just go away. So the rules that you apply are individual to each of the elements in the design, and kind of you pick different breakpoints where you change how the rules work. Responsive design then is definitely preferred to adaptive design in cases where the screen sizes are unknown or might change in the future. So unknown would be we don't have a company standard, or my audience is the general public, so I need to support as many different screen sizes as possible. The other part, though, is a little trickier about may change in the future, because to a certain extent that's true for everybody, because if you have a company standard now, that may change in the future. So you may, if you go into an adaptive design approach, you may find later that you have to make adjustments because you did that instead of a responsive design. And so I have a page here that illustrates this very easily. And I'll scroll down here. And if you watch this little animation play, as the screen size gets narrower, you can see the top bar is a responsive design, which is it gradually shrinks to fit. So it's always the same proportion relative to the overall screen. But on the bottom is an adaptive design, which as the screen size gets smaller, it stays one size all the way until you reach a different break point. And when you do, then it suddenly jumps to the smaller size. So that's a quick and easy way to see the difference. All right, Sue.
Okay, so here's our next set of FAQs. Do I need to customize for different devices and platforms? And do I need to know my target devices? And I think, as we've probably seen already, the short answer to that question is yes, or to both of those questions is yes. But let's dig into it a little bit more by looking at a few more examples. So what we have here are, again, some phone app examples. So there's, as you can see, there's two types of navigation that you have to be concerned with on differing devices. There's the on-screen navigation, which is typically unique to the application. Or if your app is web-based, it'll be whatever the browser navigation is typically. The other type of navigation is device or operating system specific. So there could be hardware controls built into the device, like the iPhone home button, or into the operating system, such as soft keys, as Android phones have, and Windows phones, which will soon no longer be an issue, apparently. But obviously those kinds of navigation elements will differ from device to device, and you have to be aware of them and account for them. And then, of course, next, tablet versus phone. We've already seen a little bit about this, but now I have both for the BMW driver's guide, both the iPhone version and the iPad version. And obviously this is an issue or an example of responsive design, I believe, Matt, not adaptive, responsive. Mm-hmm. So we have a lot more room with the tablet, and you can definitely bring your content, reserve a lot of room for your content on the tablet while still having just as big a menu available. So there's of course, a lot more flexibility with a tablet. The other thing to realize, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is that tablets are typically used in a different way than a phone. The posture that the user is in when they're using them is probably different. They're probably sitting down or maybe even reclining. They're possibly holding with two hands rather than just one. So those are the kinds of things that you, if you get really serious about designing for mobile devices, you need to think about those kinds of differences. And of course, environments are different as well, as where you use these different types of devices. Okay, so which tools should I use to design and develop mobile courses quickly? So both of us are going to address this, but let me talk first. Storyboarding and wireframing tools. So it's very important to know how to do good storyboarding, or as it's known in the development world, in the user experience design world, wireframing, but basically the same thing. And there are some good tools that you can use, ranging from something as simple as PowerPoint, which everyone has, to using your e-learning authoring tool, using drawing software or flow charting software, or even specially designed wireframing or storyboarding software. So I put a couple of good ones here. Balsamic Mockups, which is good and pretty cheap, is a good tool. And also Microsoft Visual Studio, which is really an add-in to PowerPoint. And it's good and free. And what we're going to do is what I would like to do is show you how this works in PowerPoint. So we've gotten out of presentation mode, and we're into the regular PowerPoint user interface, and you'll see that once you install this add-in called Microsoft Visual Studio, you will get a new ribbon called Storyboarding. And what it basically has is a bunch of pre-designed shapes, that you can use and drag and drop onto your slide. So for example, if I wanted to use a window background, I drag it and drop it there. And then I can pick elements, like I can put a calendar in, or a checkbox, or a button. And all of these elements are totally editable, just like any drawing object or text object in PowerPoint. And there's a whole bunch of them, as you can see: icons, media, and Windows apps, and all sorts of things. And you can design your own and save them as one of your shapes that you can then reuse. This is great. This is so easy. You can. I just discovered this recently, and it's so wonderful because it saved me from having to design my own elements, and it makes for wireframing makes it very, very easy and quick.
So this may not make so much sense for somebody who's doing instructional design for a course, but this makes a tremendous amount of sense if you are designing an app that's going to have these type of features in it.
Yeah, so if you're designing performance support, for example, and it's going to be heavily with a lot of navigation elements in it, this is a great thing to use. I'm going to switch back to our presentation. So here's an example of a wireframe that I did for an auditor app, which was going to be used as a performance support as well as learning. And as you can see, I didn't use what I showed you as the PowerPoint. I used a special app called Blueprint Wireframing. It gives you the idea. So what you need to do with wireframing is just the basics. You just need to lay out, it's used to lay out your screen. I mean, you could use it for learning. Maybe not as necessary, but you could. So here's one where I did, use built-in shapes for, menus and graphics, typed in basic information on, what buttons are, what kinds of navigation will be happening, what kind of text will be on the screen. That's the kind of stuff that you need to do in wireframing. And you will develop it, this was developed for an iPad application, so, you would do it, of course, for whatever device form factor you were going to be using. So that gives you an idea of what you can do with wireframing. And Matt?
So next I'm going to talk about, if you want to pick tools to develop, as we've been talking some already, what's the right tool to use to develop mobile learning. And so this first chart I'm showing is not for apps but for mobile websites. I divide up the tools here into categories: formatting, authoring, scripting, and programming. And further to the left is easier to use. Further to the right is more powerful, but it's a harder learning curve to use. So typically for instructional designers, the sweet spot is the authoring tools, which we've been talking about a lot already. And then if you have the capability to do JavaScript and jQuery and HTML, you might often choose the scripting level as well. The trick is that you don't want to choose something that you don't have the skill to use. That's not going to help you any. And you don't want to choose something that's more complicated than what's needed, but neither do you want to choose something that can only accomplish formatting and you need to have interactivity in it. The next chart that I'm going to show is the same categories, but now it is about apps instead of delivering for mobile websites. And typically, anything you're going to deliver through a standard LMS, a SCORM, or AICC, you're probably going to develop it as a mobile website. Something that you're going to develop as an app, you're either going to track with XAPI tracking or with proprietary tracking. In the chart here, further to the left is going to be somebody else developed the app, and you're just going to put content into it that can run in that app. And further to the right, on the far right, means that you are creating the app yourself in code like Objective-C or Java or C#. In the middle scripting here is kind of a realm where you create a mobile website of your choosing, and then you package it in an app container so that it could run offline. Next question that we get a lot is, given that there's all these millions of different combinations of operating system and device and browser, how do you test mobile learning to make sure it works? Is it a different strategy from e-learning? And do you use physical devices? So this chart shows part, not all, of browser version history across the main browsers like Chrome and Internet Explorer and Edge and Firefox and so on, Safari and some other ones. But the thing you'll note is every one of those circles is a release. And one of the trickiest things can be, and one of the most challenging things is, typically you want to say, this is going to work in Chrome version 47 and higher, and count that it's always going to work. But there have been some points where they make some mistakes as they're releasing a new browser version, and something works in Chrome 47 and 48, and then it doesn't work in Chrome 49, and then it starts working again in Chrome 50. But as you're picking what tool you want to work with, you want to think, if problems come out that we don't have compatibility across this device or that operating system or this browser, do we want to deal with that complexity, or do we want the authoring tool vendor to deal with that complexity? Then we deal with the fact we can't fix it faster, but maybe we can't fix it at all. We got to let them do it. This is what the tool browser stack looks like, which is an online service, a cloud service, where you can go in and you could say, I want to test on Android, I want to test on the Galaxy Tab 4, and then pick what browser. So you choose the browser, the device, the operating system, and then it pops up a window where you could test as though you're on that device. Some of them are actual virtual devices connected in the cloud, so you're testing through basically a web conference to the real device. Some of them are emulators. It is extremely handy to be able to do this because nobody wants to purchase 10,000 different devices to test on, but it's not entirely foolproof because on some devices it can stream audio from there to here to see if the audio is working, but on other devices it cannot. So you can't test whether the audio is working like you could on a real device. Now, because you never want to count that everything is going to be exactly right in those emulators, we also maintain a stable of a whole bunch of different kinds of devices so we can test on as many real devices as we can. But for sure, we can't test everything on every device, so we do a combination of that emulated type and virtual device and then real devices for testing. All right, Sarah, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Matt and Susan. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. Please feel free to reach out with any questions, thoughts, or further comments. Also, we have a podcast series called Learning Trends Beyond the Buzz. Each episode touches on the latest in learning trends and methods facing our industry today. We've included a link to the episodes on the slide. So finally, in a few minutes, you're going to receive a survey to complete, and early next week, we'll be sending out the slides along with the link for the recording. We thank you so much again and want you to make it a great day. Take care.